You know, back in our day, um, that was the big house. San Quentin was the big house, and Old Folsom was the big house. And
Well, they certainly looked like it. I mean,
yeah,
it,
yeah.
I actually only went to Old Folsom for one night,
Uh,
and it was creepy. It was like old men coughing their lungs out
yeah,
and
yeah,
noises,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it,
I
it was a
remember when they
bad
brought me.
feeling.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I hear what you're saying because um, when they took me to Old Folsom, I was convoyed up from Tracy. I'd been in a few altercations down there, and I got to Old Folsom, and they took me through the big old black strap iron gate in the front there, and they had the gunner up on top. And the first thing he told me, he says, "Boy, we shoot people around here." And I just looked at him. So as I was walking across the yard, they were taking me to the hole. I was the youngest person there, and as I walked across the yard, all I saw were gray heads,
Yeah, yeah.
nothing but gray heads. And I mean, you know, for a youngster like me, I was in my 20s, and I'm walking across this yard, and I've got all these old convicts turning and looking at me and talking about, looks like you got yourself in a fix, boy, or it looks like you got yourself in a fix, youngster. You know, youngster was the common term, and certainly applied to me from these cats that were in their 50s and 60s and 70s. Um, but yeah, Folsom was different. You know, I did time in the hole in San Quentin, which was no big thing, really. I mean, you had your strip cells and everything else, but I actually did time in the dungeon at Old Folsom, and that was the old black strap iron doors, and you know they could block out all light, and did, and all you had was a hole in the floor. San Quentin wasn't that primitive.
Yeah.
I mean, they had their cells, but I don't know if you remember the size of your cell, but I could take my elbow and put it on one wall and then reach my arm out the other way and touch the wall on the
Yeah,
other side.
yeah, yeah.
That's
Just
how
enough
narrow
past
they were.
to get by on the bunks. I got a
So,
question for you about
yeah.
uh, after I had an altercation in the library in San Quentin, I ended up in North Block in Punitive Seg.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, it was an absolute madhouse. I mean,
Yeah.
the guys were screaming and shouting at each other like madmen, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yo, I'll your mother, Peckerwood, and someone else would be screaming, you fucking
Mm-hmm.
baboon, and then I'll kill
Yeah.
you. And they're going on and on
Mm-hmm.
and on. And pretty
Yeah.
soon the doors start banging in the frames, and guys lighted the toilet paper on fire and jamming the toilets, and water's
Mm-hmm.
overflowing the tier.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought to myself, these guys, how are you going to live and do time like this with all this going on day in, day out? Now, you tell me how it was. Because, I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
just thought to myself, this is just bedlam. It's a madhouse.
Well, you're right. It is. I mean, it, in particular, where you're talking about on the shelf, I've been there. And so I know what you're talking about when you describe the effects. And the effect that you're really describing, John, is what it's like to put a human being in a cage. And so that when you're in that cage, particularly the cages in San Quentin, because they were just that, a cage, um, you know, that wears on you. And, you know, we don't hear enough conversation even to this day about what it's like to put a human being in a cage. So, I mean, you had some guys that were more disciplined, and I was one of them. So you worked out every day. And, you know, in my case, I was learning how to read and write. And so, you know, I was in the books, and eventually, you know, they had that program there at UC Berkeley, and it was a correspondence course. So I was in my undergraduate studies at Berkeley. And so I kept my face in the books, and of course we had our gang activity. So, you know, at that time, I was restructuring the infrastructure of the brand at San Quentin. So it was about communications. So as you know, the brand ran all the job programs in San Quentin. So we assigned clerks to different areas, and if I needed to meet with somebody, I would have them duck at me off the shelf to the X-ray laboratory in New Miller Hospital. And so we would meet there, and then we do our business, and then we'd be escorted back. And there was really nothing they could do about that. If you got a ducat, as you know, then, you know, the guards had to come get you and escort you over. But, you know, going back to the idea of the bedlam that existed on those tiers, you know, that was real. And it was really a form of collective psychosis. You know, I've coined the term in earlier years, pincosis, and that's where you take the penitentiary and psychosis and you merge the two, as a result of a human being being in a cage. And the term actually comes from zoochosis, where they take a wild animal and they capture it and they put it in a cage and it dies. And the thing we need to remember, even as human beings, and even though we've been blessed with those 4 layers of the brain and cognitive ability, is that it still impacts upon you being in that cage. And
well, I mean, sometimes guys would say, you know, rest your neck. The gates are not open and you're not going to kill anyone, right? It's just dummy up, right?
well, yeah,
But the voices of reason were few and far between.
that's
you know?
true. Yeah. So it was sort of a venting process. You know, you got guys that talk out the side of their neck all day long. And, you know, I don't know if you remember the term jawjacker, but, you know, I've reinvented that term in recent years in my writings and otherwise, so that people begin to understand what a jawjacker is. You know, it's not just somebody that talks out the side of their neck, but it's somebody that just jacks their jaw because they need to. You know,
Oh,
they
we
need.
used to call it selling wolf tickets, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I've heard a few wolf tickets over the years, and you know, we call them cell warriors. You know, they're selling wolf tickets, and we've all got the terminology relative to, you know, how to shut somebody down in that. I mean, you used to hear people go back and forth, you know, talking to each other, and it was a release actually for them. You know, some
Well,
people.
I got to
Go
say
ahead.
something. That actually, I used to listening to it. I used to sit and listen to them
Yeah,
because you had nothing else to do. It was basically the
right.
entertainment we had.
Yeah,
And I got the feeling that the blacks were basically a bit more intelligent and a bit better at it than the whites were, right?
very
The
much
whites
so.
would
I mean, yeah.
the whites would just come off with straight up abuse, but the blacks would like spin little stories where they didn't
Yeah.
really make it.
Hmm. Yeah, no, they had it down, and you know, that's that being streetwise.
Yeah,
You know, growing up in the inner city, and you know, you're right. I mean, the blacks had their Mac in place, so they could Mac all day long, and it was rare to find the white boy that could stay up with them. You know,
yeah,
relative to that talk, that Mac.
yeah.
There were a few. You know, Ronnie Harper was one of them. You know, he would stay with them all day long, and typically shut them down. But again, that was their way of actually coping with where they were at.
Right.
You know, releasing that stress to some extent. And you had people, I mean, you may not have, but I've had people, I've watched them hang themselves. I've watched them cut their own throats because they couldn't deal with the cell.
Yeah.
And the time that we were doing in the cells, you know, during that. I mean, you were in East Block initially and you went to North Block, but you were Bayside East Block. So you had all those windows and they were all broken out so that you could get air.
Yeah.
See, and during the winter, we used to smuggle wood in from the warehouse and build little fires in front of our cell to keep warm. I mean, I had a pipe, as a matter of fact, this pipe right here. This pipe's name is stove. And I had that with me. And what I would do is that I would, you know, back then, remember they supplied tobacco to us?
Yeah.
We used to get
Bull
those
Durham.
pouches. That's right.
Bull
And I
Durham.
used to pack a stove here with tobacco, and I'd get it glowing just red hot, and I'd wrap my hands around it, and that would keep me warm. You know, and that's one of the, you know, methods that I used. I mean, in addition to building fires in front of my cell, that didn't please the guards because where you were at and where I was at, they had that catwalk out in front of the cells. So they'd walk with their M14s on that catwalk, and you know, they'd tell you put the fire out, and you know what the response was. You want the fire out, you put the fire out. You know, but the guards typically back then weren't going to come on the tier
No.
to facilitate that.
Well, I mean, guys would just be throwing cups of shit and piss on them if they did. So
Yeah,
who
they
would
get
want to
gas.
be?
That's right.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that I never engaged in was gassing. I don't believe in it. You know, it's like, you know, I don't care what your thinking is about another man. I'm not going to spit on him. I'm not going to throw caustic materials like urine or feces on him. There's no respect in that. I would never do something like that. I actually received write-ups for it, but that was during riots that we had back in Old Folsom, where they just, you know, the burning that you're talking about and the flooding and everything else. And they would just write everybody up. They wouldn't even come on the tier. They just would go down
Right.
the ledger and you get a write-up. And, but I actually never engaged in that activity. But you're right; it went on a lot.
Well, I could never see the point because
No,
we were in a powerless position,
that's
and
right.
there's so many different ways that they could get theirs on us that
Yeah.
needlessly provoking them was
Hmm.
pointless and just
Hmm.
dangerous, right?
Yeah.
I've got a question for you, and this is something that I don't understand.
Hmm.
You know, in your second podcast, it talked about going man on man, mano a
Hmm.
mano in knife
Hmm.
fights with, you
Hmm.
know, Hugo Pinel and different people.
Hmm.
And this is on the yard.
Hmm.
Now, what I'm wondering is if you both want to be there, if you both choose to be there, why
Hmm.
not choose a quiet place, some place where you can work it out with nobody watching and nobody interrupting the program? I
Yeah.
mean,
Those are, yeah.
if
Hmm.
you do it on the upper yard, you're only going to be in it for a couple minutes at least
Right.
before
Right.
it gets broken up.
Yeah, the ideal situation is to find a blind spot like you're talking about. And that's really what you're talking about is a blind spot where you point people out and then you both have your weapons and you engage in combat. And I've done that, and that's actually where you have the opportunity to bleed your opponent. And, it becomes a real dance associated with that. But in a case of like Yogi Pinel, and we were in the hole. So you don't
Oh,
have the
okay.
opportunity to go elsewhere. So the key to survival there in the knife fight I was in with Yogi was to keep moving. Now I took an M14 slug in my back that day, um, and it obviously put me down. But not before I had engaged Yogi and we did our dance in the context of that yard. I mean, you just had to keep moving, and you knew that.
Well, the thing is, you saw for me the
Hmm.
gunners were more of a risk. They were the danger. They were the lethal danger as far as I was concerned. So the idea of
Yeah.
having a fist fight. I mean, I had a guy who tried to start a fist fight on the upper yard at Quentin, but I just ducked out of it because the last thing I want to do is give the gunners a chance to shoot me through
Hmm.
the spine or something and drop me
Yeah,
on
well,
the deck.
that's why you don't engage in fist fights. I mean, fist fights, for all intents and purposes, really weren't allowed. And I mean, they happened. Don't get me wrong, as you well know. But a fist fight would shut down business. So, if you had a fight, then they had to do a risk assessment, particularly if they were gang members, and so they would shut down the joint, and that stopped business. So you didn't want to intrude upon that business. But I don't know that I've ever really been in a fist fight in prison. I've been in many knife fights,